right, we got folks joining. Okay, so great. I'm going to give it a minute as we're getting folks that join. I see a lot of friends in the audience today. So I think this is going to be a really interesting and great webinar. Okay, folks, it's 12:01 and I want to use our time wisely. So I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jen Walling, the Executive Director of the Illinois Environmental Council. And thank you for joining our webinar today on the Illinois Commerce Commission and the future of gas process. Hannah Demboski is going to put several times into the chat the CLE form for Illinois attorneys, so fill that out. And if you are like me and still need about 3 hours today, hope that it is helpful. We will make sure that it gets entered today so we can get our hours. So there's the CLE sign in. But for anybody, this is going to be a really interesting workshop, workshop pun intended, I guess, on the future of gas and the process that's going on at the Illinois Commerce Commission. This has been a really interesting piece, a really cooperative piece that I think we're going to learn a lot about today. I'm really excited to have Madeline from NRDC and Curt from Environmental Defense Fund. But I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie to give the intros. But for folks that are on, if you have questions, I believe we're going to take them at the end. You can put stuff in the chat during it, like if you have a pressing question, and I will try to get it answered. But we're going to take questions towards the end of this webinar. So if you got them, put them in, and we will answer them as they come in. And then for folks wondering, we will be recording this and we will be sending around the slides and recording and a survey following this presentation. So great. Well, I'm going to head it over to Stephanie Blumenthal, who is working on IEC on this work, and she'll introduce Madeline Curt.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Blumenthal. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm happy to be working at IEC as their Climate Policy Programs Manager. In that role, I'm really lucky to get to work with Madeline and Curt through the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, where we are working to further regulatory and legislative action to make our buildings cleaner. There's a lot of different avenues that we're working on that. One of them happens to be, or a few of them happen to be through the Illinois Commerce Commission. So I'm really glad to have both of these lovely folks here to chat more about that. Madeline works at NRDC and is their Illinois lead. And we're really lucky to have her. And Curt is a senior attorney at EDF, who leads our future of gas work. And Madeline leads the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition's clean buildings policy work. Really grateful to work with them both. And I'm going to be sharing slides today. So happy to have you guys add any details to your intros that I missed, and gonna hand it over to y'all now.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Hello, all. Once again, Madeline Semanisin. I use she, her pronouns, and thank you to IEC for having us today. We can go to the next slide. Great. And I will also to just introduce my co-presenter, Curt Stokes.
Yeah, I'm Curt Stokes. I'm he, him pronouns. I am a senior attorney at Environmental Defense Fund, and I've been working on utility regulatory issues in several states for just right around a decade now, and happy to be here sharing our presentation with all of you.
Great, and I've got so your hand was raised. Was there something you wanted to add? Oh, and the CLE info is not going in the chat, so Hannah Demboski, it's just going to the hosts and panelists. There we go. There we go.
Sorry, just switched it. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, and I see hand flap, your hand raised. Nothing. Okay, great. We have got the CL info in the chat correctly. So appreciate you. If everybody wants to fill that out, thank you.
Great. Yeah, it's important info to get those CLE credits. So yeah, today we're just going to give a quick overview of the Illinois Commerce Commission. And then we're going to talk about some bread and butter cases such as gas rate cases that are typical at the commission. And then the second half of the presentation, we're going to transition to longer term planning dockets and workshops that really grapple with the concept of decarbonization in the natural gas sector. And so in that portion, we'll be covering the future of gas proceeding, long-term gas infrastructure planning, and non-pipeline alternatives. So 2 pieces to this presentation today. Next slide, Stephanie. Thank you. So just briefly, quickly, I think most folks know, but the Illinois Commerce Commission is our state's public utility commission, our PUC. They have regulatory authority to regulate all investor-owned utilities in gas, water, electric, and telecommunications. And so for the purpose of this conversation, we're really talking about them regulating Peoples Gas, NICOR, North Shore Gas, and Ameren, our large investor-owned gas utilities in the state of Illinois. Curt will talk about later their rate setting authority. They have the authority to set the rates to make sure they're just and reasonable. And they also have oversight on capital investments and expenditures through these investor-owned utilities. So making sure that the investments are not overly plated, making sure that they are investing in infrastructure that makes us more safer. And more recently, compared to the last couple of bullets, they are required to start considering how to implement the climate policies of the state. So for instance, the ICC plays a big role in implementing the Clean and Equitable Jobs Act. And so for this conversation, we're really talking about how they regulate the gas sector. Next slide. Great.
Thank you. And yeah, just for background, you might be wondering what is a rate case? What does the ICC actually look at? The very high level background is the state of Illinois and many other states have recognized that natural monopolies like public utilities need to be regulated by the state because in the absence of actual market competition, natural monopoly incentives kick in and price distortions and consumer protections kind of fall away. The leading case on the United States for all of this, it actually came out of warehouses in the city of Chicago. It's called Munn versus Illinois. And if you want to look it up, it is, the citation for that is 94 US 113. And you can learn all about the history of how things like the toll bridges, ferries, warehouses were regulated in Old England and how that supports the regulation of public utilities today. But the entire idea is that instead of negotiating individual rates with customers, the utility regulator, in this case, the Illinois Commerce Commission, sets tariffs. And the utility files a proposed tariff, which is kind of like a contract, but it also has the power of statute and law. With the ICC approves or modifies that as they see fit. And then the utility has to charge that rate to its customers. And that's called the filed rate doctrine. And in order to change the filed rate doctrine, they have to file a rate case with the utility. Under Illinois' Public Utility Act, cited here, the rates must be just and reasonable. Just and reasonable, as you can probably guess, gives a lot of discretion to the utility commission, but it also has some constitutional guardrails in there that we'll get into shortly. The ICC and the Public Utility Act also requires the ICC to support safety, health, comfort, and convenience of its customers, employees, and the public. So there's a very broad public interest regulation here. It's not just the rates; it's also governing safety, health, and convenience, and not just of utility customers, but the public in general. So, like when you think about pipelines and overhead power lines, those are also affecting the public, not just customers. And if we go to the next slide, the 3 phases of the rate case. I've heard the analogy that it's kind of like making a pie. And the first phase, where you set the revenue requirement, it's if the pie is like how much revenue does the utility require to provide its service. And under cost of service rate making, which is kind of like what Illinois does for gas utilities, and what a lot of other state commissions do, you look at your utility operating expenses. So how much does it cost to pay your employees? How much does it cost to hire contractors and buy the equipment that you need? And then you add in your rate base. So like your major capital investment. So for a gas company, it's like, how much do your compressors cost? How much are your pipelines? How much do those cost? And then you subtract out the depreciation. So if you assume that a pipeline is going to last 50 years, your annual depreciation rate is 2%. And so you subtract out 2% of that rate base. Other things, things like, for example, like service trucks, those might have like, for easy math, like a 10-year depreciation time. So the depreciation rates for all the different property will be different. But you subtract that out. Depreciation is actually then added back in as an operating expense later on. But if you really want to get into that, we can maybe go to a NARUC training. You take that rate base then and multiply it by the rate of return. The rate of return is essentially like how much profit the utility is entitled to earn on its rate base investments. And that these all go back to U.S. Supreme Court cases, Hope and Bluefield from the 1920s and 1940s. The idea is when the utility regulator sets rates for the utility, it has to set rates that compensate the utility for at a rate that is comparable to entities facing similar risk. So there's usually a comparison in these rate cases. We hire finance experts that look at what's called return on equity and say, how much is the cost of investing in a utility specifically, and that usually falls out between 8 and 10%, depending on what state you're in. But some states go over 10%, and it changes year by year. But the takeaway from that revenue requirement formula is that utilities have that incentive to invest in rate base. The bigger that rate base, then you multiply that by the rate of return, and that's how much profit you make. And so that's why utilities like to invest in capital and like to hang power lines overhead, put pipelines underground, that kind of thing. That you then move to the second phase of rate making, which is you allocate the cost among the customers. So if you go back to the pie analogy, like, unlike normal pie, different customer classes here are fighting for the smallest piece possible. They want to pay for the least amount of that revenue requirement as possible. So residential ratepayers, industrial ratepayers, and commercial ratepayers, they'll all kind of jockey and raise very sophisticated and good arguments about why they should pay more or less for the overall revenue requirement that was set in the first phase. Then the third phase is once you figure out, like, okay, residentials, you're on the hook for this percentage. You figure out, like, how is the contract structured? How is that tariff structured to actually collect that revenue from that customer class? And for residential ratepayers, if you look at your utility bill, you'll probably see a fixed charge. That amount, it stays the same month to month. And the idea is that is generally associated with the utility's fixed costs. Costs that don't change depending on how much usage changes. And then you also have a volumetric charge. So for electric utilities, how much do you pay per kilowatt hour? Gas utilities, how much do you pay per CCF cubic centimeters? I forget what CCF stands for, but or therms, which is like the heat value of the gas. Then you might also see some other riders. So things like low-income discount rates, taxes, cost of gas, weather normalization. Different states have different riders, and those are essentially the three phases of a rate case. And then once all of that comes out, then the utility commission decides on what the rates are, how to design them, and then the utility has to file its final tariffs, which reflect that customer or that regulator decision. And if you go to the next slide. So this is where we get into non-rate case revenues and how that affects regulation. So in 2023, the Illinois qualifying infrastructure plant surcharge statute expired. But what that statute did was it allowed gas utilities to recover the cost of pipelines outside of rate cases. So it would make major investments in pipelines, pipeline replacements, essentially designed to replace old, unsafe, and worn out infrastructure, like particularly cast iron and some unprotected pipe that were causing safety issues. If you remember, there was a major California event in around 2011 that triggered some of these statutes. And Illinois was not the only one to have it. But what this surcharge allowed the utility to do was to recover the cost of that pipeline without having to file a rate case. Again, it expired in 2023. So what we've seen is since then, utilities have filed rate cases in 2024 and then again in 2025. And the reason they do that is a concept called regulatory lag. So if a utility makes investments in its infrastructure, it can't start collecting on that investment until it files a rate case and gets those rates approved and gets that investment reflected in its rates. And if it doesn't file a rate case, all those investments just kind of sit out there. And there are ways for the utility to carry those carrying costs and collect it or carry it and include it in its next rate case, but they're not actually collecting the cash. So the cash flow doesn't get affected until the rate case is finalized. So that's why we're seeing more frequent rate cases. The utilities are incentivized to invest in rate base, but they don't get that rate base until they get it in a rate case, and they don't have that qualifying infrastructure plant surcharge anymore. You might have heard it referred to as a QIP. And then so yeah, that's kind of the background and information on like why gas utilities are filing such frequent rate cases in the last 2 years. So next slide. In that last rate case, in the 2022 rate cases, the commission found in all of the rate cases, so for all three major utilities, and I'm three meaning Peoples and North Shore, the commission found that in CEJA, which is the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, the state codified a goal of economy-wide 100% clean energy by 2050. It recognized that CEJA gave the commission and other state agencies authority to pursue decarbonization strategies, and it mentioned the electric sector specifically. But CEJA was actually relatively silent on the gas system. Nevertheless, the commission found in all of those rate cases that if the decarbonization goals of CEJA are to be met, the gas distribution system as currently operated will need to change. And that's where we get the future of gas. And that's what Madeline will talk about now.
Great, thanks, Curt. So now we're transitioning into these longer term planning dockets, really trying to figure out how we can meet the goals of CEJA and decarbonize the gas system. Next slide, please. But first, let's just say, what is a future of gas process? In its simplest terms, it's usually kicked off by the state legislator or a state commission, really trying to explore what the role of the natural gas system is in light of the state's adopted climate goals. How do we get from 100% clean energy if we're still burning methane gas in our homes? And so states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, New York, California, Minnesota have all kicked off future of gas processes. As Curt mentioned, ours started in Illinois through gas rate cases. Other states have started theirs through legislation. And so there's that great quote again at the end of this slide, really what Curt just said, if we are going to meet those goals, this system must look different. So in 2023, the commission, the 5 appointed commissioners, directed the commission staff to start the future of gas process in Illinois to really explore these ideas. Next slide, please. And just to step back for reasons on why we need a future of gas process, some of these policy arguments and the need for how we're going to meet our climate goals started popping up in rate cases. And the commission thought that there would be a better place to have that conversation. And that conversation is happening in the future of gas process. And some of the things that advocates like NRDC, like EDF, were highlighting is we have a climate problem, a consumer protection problem, and a public health problem. And to start with the climate problem, Roughly 20% emissions in Illinois come from the residential and commercial sector. It's even higher if you include industrial users that burn methane gas. In the city of Chicago, that number is closer to 70%. So, quite frankly, to meet our climate goals, we really will have to do something about burning methane gas in our homes and businesses. And unlike the other sectors, such as the electric sector or the transportation sector, that have made strides towards emissions reductions, the conversation is a little bit newer in the building sector. So I would argue this has really started to kickstart, excuse me, that decarbonization question. And this is a long conversation. This is a long-term transition, but we must start the conversation now so we can get closer to our 2050 goals of, zero emissions. It's also a consumer protection issue with burning methane gas in our house. As Curt mentioned, excuse me, that there are two parts of our bill. There's the fixed charge and volumetric charge. In the Midwest, Illinois leads with some of the highest fixed charges across the Midwest. So even if you try to conserve your energy through energy efficient upgrades, such as switching out to a cold climate heat pump, such as, installing new windows, you're still having to pay a lot of money towards that fixed charge. It's a public health issue. A recent study in the last few years came out and said that 20% of childhood asthma cases in Illinois are linked to gas stove usage. So there is a through line between children growing up in homes with gas stoves versus children growing up with electric stoves or induction stoves. And there's also other medical issues that happen when we burn gas in our homes because it's a known carcinogen. And last, I just want to highlight this slide, or excuse me, this graphic from the Building Decarbonization Coalition. This report came out around this time last year, and it shows what would happen if we don't have a managed transition to 2050. And what it's shown is if gas utilities continue to invest at their normal rate, which we know they're going beyond that normal rate of 6% each year, and 50% of folks leave the gas system, whether it's because of they're concerned about climate, maybe they got a federal rebate to install a heat pump, whatever the reason is, if 50% of the population leaves by 2050, we start to see our gas bills double in the mid 2030s for all four investor owned utilities. So, this is also, I would argue, a huge equity issue. So, we cannot have the people with the less means to electrify or install newer clean technologies to be left on this system. As Curt mentioned, that pie analogy, the pie does not change of how much we owe gas utilities depending on how many people are on the system. And so the fewer people on the system, the more likely their bills will go up. And that's what this is showing. And so we really need to worry about how we plan out this transition so it's based in equity to make sure the folks who have the least means are not paying more. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So that's the reason why we argue that there is such a need in the state of Illinois for the future of gas process. And so luckily, our commission kicked off that process last spring. What was originally supposed to be a year has now extended to February of 2026. And the way our future of gas process is structured, it's a workshop process, which means that advocates can communicate to commissioners, they can communicate to commission staff. It's supposed to be very collaborative on how we work with other stakeholders. Stakeholders are anywhere from enviro groups, consumer advocates, faith-based groups, gas utilities, and people who sell gas furnaces, all coming together over these large WebEx meetings to really grapple with how we decarbonize the building sector. This is slightly different than how other states have handled this process, where they have gone more into a quasi like kind of case format where advocates would have the power of discovery and could compel information from gas utilities. But under that format, we would not have access to commissioners or commission staff. So we're more right now into the workshop phase. And because of that, we have broken it down. The commission staff has broken it down into two phases, phase one and phase two. Phase one has completed, and that was the neutral fact finding place. where anyone with an idea related to building decarbonization, gas system transition could submit comments to the staff to compile a report on all the ideas on how to decarbonize the gas system. This was a neutral conversation. We were not picking apart the other side's arguments during phase one. So, for example, NRDC and other environmental organizations submitted comments saying, we believe building electrification, swapping out, gas furnaces with cold climate heat pumps and increasing energy efficiency is the best way to reduce emissions. And we believe that should be a strong pathway forward. On the other end of the spectrum, gas utilities were saying we need to burn more methane gas. This is increasing. We just maybe need to change how we're capturing gas. And so it was a huge wide spectrum in phase one. As we transition into phase two, which is broken down into 3 categories, more positions can be identified and stakeholders can take positions. And so that's where we are right now. This time is also where groups can submit pilot proposals to test out new technologies, test out new concepts to decarbonize the gas sector. So right now we are in phase 2B. At the end of phase 2B, which is expected to happen sometime later on this year, that's when all groups have come together essentially and decided that these are the pathways that we will reduce emissions from the building sector. So could that be, 80% is going to be met with electrification and energy efficiency, some support from thermal energy networks, and maybe a little bit of green hydrogen to reach those hard to decarbonize sectors. Or it could be a variety of different solutions and pathways on how to hit zero emissions. Once those are decided on, and once the most cost-effective solution is presented, then we would move into legislative and regulatory solutions. So I should note that at the end of Future of Gas, the process in February, there will not be an instant regulatory shift or an instant legislative law that's adopted. It's just a report that is being sent to the legislator and the public saying, these are our suggestions on how to decarbonize the natural gas sector. And here are the cost considerations, the workforce considerations, and the electric grid considerations. So that's where we're at right now. Next slide, Stephanie, please. Great. And so this is just directly, the next 3 slides are directly from the Commission's order in 2023 on considerations that we should be exploring through the future gas process. And there should be some type of recommendation in the final report that's related to each of these bullet points. So I've just highlighted a few so you guys can kind of get a feeling for what kind of arguments are being raised in this process. So, right off the bat, the potential for decarbonization of the existing gas sector. As I already mentioned, advocates like NRDC and other enviros are advocating for cleaner technologies to decarbonize the gas system. Or on the other hand, gas utilities are exploring options such as renewable natural gas, green hydrogen, and more delayed tactics, saying that this transition is really not occurring. And so, there is some back and forth on all of these issues. And because of that, the commission will most likely have to request for proposals on a pathway study. And a pathway study would help shape the conversation to ensure that we are only putting forth ideas that that technology is available today and that they're the most cost effective. So we are expecting a report to come out before the final report on a pathway study. But regardless, there are some things that groups can agree on. And one of those is energy efficiency. No matter what kind of advocate you are in this space, most of the groups agree that energy efficiency investments are going to need to happen to either decarbonize the gas system and switch to electrification or still reduce emissions through energy efficiency. Looking at time, I'm going to go ahead and skip the next 2. Stephanie, please. And so just highlight that those are some of the issues being explored. Some of the challenges we're facing in the future of gas docket is not all of the right parties are in the room. So for instance, we don't have tenant protection groups in the room. We don't always have workforce specialists, and there's also a need for prioritization. So those are some of the challenges we're grappling with through this process and why there has been an extension order. And then for the last slide for this topic, one more, Stephanie. Just to say, throughout this process and despite those challenges, the Clean Jobs Coalition hopes that the final report at the conclusion of fall will include some type of emissions reduction goal for the building sector, similar to what we have on the electric side. It plainly states the health impacts of burning methane gas in our homes, correctly quantifies what types of technologies are available today to decarbonize the building sector, such as cold-cutting heat pumps, thermal energy networks, and then also the need for integrated gas and electric planning. So we're hoping that we have this really great report that we can take to a legislator or the the ICC to make these changes to start that transition. But with that, I will pass it to Curt to talk about other planning workshops and processes the commission is undertaking.
Thank you, Madeline. The second part that came out of the 2022 rate cases was a requirement to do long-term gas infrastructure plans. There's some appeals and litigation ongoing about that. They kind of call some of it into question, but NICOR at least is still going forward with its with its filing. And to really understand what integrated resource planning is and what a long-term gas infrastructure plan would look like, I'm going to dial back to the history of integrated resource planning on the electric utility side. And next slide is good. Long-term integrated resource planning on the electric side started about 30, 40 years ago in response to a lot of different challenges, including environmental concerns, fuel price volatility. At the time, it was coal primarily, capital cost overruns. So nuclear power plants were costing more than what the electric utilities had originally estimated. And increasingly diverse resources were available. So things like energy efficiency, instead of just upgrading power lines and power plants, we all of a sudden realized that we could buy more energy efficient appliances. And if any of those challenges sound familiar today on the gas side, you're exactly right. And that's kind of why a lot of states are starting to look at long-term gas planning. As I mentioned earlier, rate cases are a good way to get a snapshot in time of a gas system and what it costs to serve customers today. But what it is not good at is zooming out and getting a bigger picture of where the gas system is going, like where it's going to be in 20, 30 years, and how we're going to get there. So if I were to create an analogy, it would be, imagine you're in a car and you tell your passenger, every time we hit an intersection, just tell me straight, turn left, turn right, and I'll just keep going that way. That's the rate case approach. So, and your passenger's the gas utility. Every time you hit a stop sign, or in this case, a rate case, the gas utility is asking the driver, in this case, the regulator, keep going straight. Let's turn right. Let's turn left. You never know. You don't know where you're going. You don't know how you're going to get there, but you'll get somewhere at some time. That's not a great place to be. You really want to know how, where are you going and how you're going to get there. And that's where the long-term gas infrastructure plans come in. That's where you have like a GPS. You say, I want to go here and I want to find the most efficient route there to get there. And so if we go to the next slide, again, the history of like how do we require long-term planning? At the federal level, if anybody's familiar with the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978, this was like the very end of Jimmy Carter's administration. Gas price volatility was a major problem. Congress passed PURPA, and it directed every electric utility in the United States to do some sort of integrated resource planning, to file those with their state regulator. And the plans had to show how the utilities were selecting new energy resources. So are you going with coal plants, nuclear plants, gas plants, energy efficiency? What are you doing? What kind of power purchase agreements are you signing? What kind of energy conservation efforts are you making on efficiency? Like even back then we had solar and things like district heating and cooling and renewable, like wind energy. So, wind and solar have been a thing at least since 1978. And so that was the first effort in 1978. A lot of utilities began doing that, and so states undertook it and kind of created their own requirements. And so really for like 40 years, we've had long-term planning for electric utilities in the United States. It's gone very well. Some states have kind of pulled back on it, especially as part of the deregulatory effort in the early 2000s, but that's kind of paused. So states are no longer pulling back from this. And if we go to the next slide, Congress actually expanded integrated resource planning to public utilities. In this case, in the Energy Policy Act of 1992, the Western Area Power Administration, which is kind of like a large water generation resource in the western states, had to do its own resource planning. And they're the ones who provide power to a lot of municipal and public agencies in the western states. So like, you know, I guess you're going to do a takeaway, like long-term planning has definitely been a thing for a long time on the electric side. So if we go to the next slide, you can see a list of all the states with long-term planning requirements for electric utilities, and it's almost all of them. You know, you'll notice a few carve-outs like Texas and some of the Northeast states that did deregulation efforts in the early 2000s have not re-upped theirs, but as of 2020, most states require their electric utilities to do long-term infrastructure planning. Now compare that with the next slide, which is the states that require long-term gas planning. And it's not nearly as many, but there are a lot of western states, Colorado, Minnesota, Georgia, which I thought was interesting, and New York, now require their gas utilities to file long-term gas plan requirements with their regulator. I have Illinois in blue there because of the appellate cases that are happening right now. We should have an answer shortly whether the long-term gas planning requirements imposed by the commission rate case orders in 2022 were sufficient, or if we're going to have to undergo a rulemaking that would impose those long-term gas infrastructure planning requirements by like an official, like the Illinois Administrative Procedure Act rulemaking process with, like, you know, filing notice of opportunity to comment and official promulgation of rules. And if we go to the next slide, we'll start talking about some of what are the basic requirements. Some states have done it through legislation. So Nevada and Colorado, their requirements are legislative. So those are very set in stone. They're very durable, not easily changed. Other states have gone either the rulemaking route or the commission order route. The Washington, California, and New York, which are some of the first states to take action, did it through a rulemaking process, but Oregon, Georgia, Minnesota, and Illinois went with the faster commission order route. The rulemaking route is somewhat more durable. It's a little bit more flexible than legislation. It can be changed a little bit easier under the Illinois or under the most state administrative procedure acts than passing legislation and having it signed by the governor, or even undertaking like a ballot measure and taking it to voters in a November election. But Illinois is among those states that did commission order, and as we saw, it's a little bit more subject to legislative challenge. It's also somewhat more subject to future changes from the Illinois Commerce Commission. So it's just a commission order. Any of those commissions could rescind or modify that order at any time under whatever authority they have to issue orders and amend their previous orders. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to go through a few examples and talk about some of the common elements of what should be included in a long-term gas infrastructure plan. If you're interested in digging in more, I've provided some citations here, but the most common requirement I have seen in the states that require these plans is to have the gas utility come in with a mix of supply and conservation efforts to meet current and future needs. There's almost always a requirement that the plan has a preferred resource mix that will provide the lowest reasonable cost to the utility and its customers. And if you search long-term gas plans and quote and use that quote lowest reasonable cost, you're going to find that's in most of these state plans. And that's one of the first states that took action on this almost 20 years ago in 2006. And if we go to the next one, we can talk about how we figured that out. So the first thing is the utility files a demand forecast. try to figure out, is demand increasing or decreasing? And then it's usually an open process, so stakeholders can intervene. They get the underlying calculations and assumptions and inputs that go into that forecast and test those forecasts. How sensitive are they to changing circumstances? Are they based on realistic assumptions and inputs, or are they overly optimistic? The other element is that the utility has to look at all commercially available conservation measures like energy efficiency, electrification, energy efficient appliances. They can't just categorically rule out entire categories of alternatives the way that we see a lot of gas utilities might do in a rate case. They have to really look at all available technology that's available to them currently and make some assumptions about what technologies might be available in the future. Washington is relatively unique in that it requires the utilities to file progress reports on its previously filed plans. So I really like this element of Washington's planning, that you can kind of see not just where you're going, but where you've been and how well you're moving along your intended path. And that's a relatively unique provision. Not all states have that, and I think it's a really good idea to have that kind of like that rearview mirror. And then that is part of the process. The other part I thought was really interesting is the Washington order expressly says that the commission can consider the plan, including the progress on the plan, when evaluating performances in the Washington rate cases. So I thought that was pretty good signal to the utilities that they better file good rate plans, and they better make progress on those long-term gas plans. They can't just file them and then kind of go back to business as usual. So that, yeah, that's one of the first long-term gas plan requirements. If we go to the next slide, we can kind of look at some of the more recent ones. Oregon, they require their utilities to file these every 2 years, similar to what the Illinois Commerce Commission ordered in its rate cases. I've talked with an Oregon commissioner about this. They do get regular progress reports. I think there's a feeling in Oregon that maybe they get the reporting can be improved a little bit, but it is, again, one of the older requirements that goes back about 18 years. And again, Oregon requires least cost utility planning. So this is a very much, even if you are not as concerned about the environmental impacts of the gas system, you are probably concerned about the impacts that Madeline talked about of continued investment in the gas system on ratepayers. And so that's why they have the least cost utility planning. And there's a big convergence between ratepayer interests and environmental interests in energy efficiency and electrification and lowering overall costs. And if we go to the next slide. Interest of time, I'm going to skip this one. That's just a recap of more. California, about 10 years ago, did their own Senate Bill 350 that kind of looked at like future of gas. To implement that, Senate Bill 350 in California is very similar to CEJA in Illinois. It had set decarbonization goals by 2050, et cetera. The California Public Utility Commission in 2020 implemented rulemaking that set three tracks. Track one is undergoing right now. It's the reliability standards and regulatory changes needed to improve coordination between gas utilities and gas-fired electric generation. That's that coordinated gas and electric planning that we'll talk about a little bit later. That's another thing that we'd probably like to see come out of future of gas. Track two is the long-term planning strategy. So that's very similar to the long-term gas planning we're seeing in all these other states. But track three, which was recently proposed, is requiring each utility to identify short, medium, and long-term mechanisms for managing the gas transition. So whereas the Illinois Future of Gas investigation is more, it is focused on short, medium, and long-term mechanisms. In California, the proposal is to have each utility file their own proposals that would resolve the gas transition challenges on a short, medium, and long-term basis for each individual utility's service territory. That's relatively newer and unique and something to think about. If we go to the next slide, the track 2 began in March 2023. The planning horizon is for 10 years. So they filed in 2023. They have to look out to 2033. And every gas utility has to report every planned investment that's over $50 million. And $50 million sounds like a lot, but for a gas utility, it's actually pretty small. So that's gonna cover a lot of planned investments in the state of California. Going to give the California PUC a lot of visibility into what the gas utilities are planning, and not just over the next year in a rate case, but over the next 10 years. So like 10 rate cases or 5 rate cases if you file every other year. Can we go to the next slide? Again, it's very similar to every other state. You want to have demand forecasts, supply forecasts. You want to make sure that the gas utilities plans are going to maintain safety and reliability standards. Where California probably exceeds a lot of other states is meeting those reliability and demand standards and safety standards using non-pipeline alternatives. And that's definitely something that Madeline's going to cover next. So go to the next slide. Again, New York, we can skip this. There's just different planning horizons, how often they file, whether or not they're independently verified or verified by commission staff or other stakeholders. Again, demand forecast, all that. So Illinois, I have a link there. If you download the slides, you can click on that link and get the November 2023 rate decisions that kicked off future gas, the future of gas investigation and long-term gas plans. Like I mentioned earlier, NICOR is filing their long-term gas infrastructure plan. Peoples and Ameren still under appeal, to be decided still. So go to the next slide. The Illinois, again, a lot of similar requirements from other states, and we should get a lot more visibility into gas planning investments, and including the revenue requirement impacts. And we should get a lot better visibility into like not just the investments, but the decision-making process behind those investments. And again, Illinois, like other states, the lowest societal cost investments, which I thought was a very deliberate use of language in the orders. They're looking not just at ratepayer costs, but societal costs. So they're really taking into account the public health and environmental risks of continued investment in the gas system. So I think that's very good language from the commission that we got in these orders. That's the language from the 5th District Court of Appeals, reversing the Illinois Commission on the long-term gas infrastructure plan, saying, hey, you should have followed the Illinois Administrative Procedure Act when you did this with a public notice and comment opportunity. You know, this rule applies to all gas utilities equally. Therefore, it like meets the definition of a rulemaking. So that's something to watch. I believe this case has now been appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court. We'll see where it goes. So, and that's just more language from the Illinois cases that we can skip. Finally, I'll wrap this up really quick. Lessons learned from IRP. This is from AEEE. Lesson 1 is the Public Utility Commissions are definitely the right agency at the state level to implement these planning requirements. Because PUCs can affect change comprehensively. They've got all the right levers. They decide rates, they decide safety and reliability standards for these utilities. They've got the right leverage over the right people to maintain transparency and accountability. So yeah, when we talk about these long-term gas infrastructure plans, we're definitely doing it in the right place, bringing it before the ICC. But the next lesson is public utility commissions and legislatures, they're subject to regulatory capture, just like any other governmental agency. So in order to succeed and kind of keep the pressure on, we really need to build a broad support base and maintain pressure on implementing these long-term plans. Like Madeline said, we need more stakeholder voices, tenants' rights organizations, cities, builders. We really need, and labor. We need all these voices in the process to really build a broad coalition of support. And we also need, as environmental advocates, listen and respond to legitimate criticism and identify improvements to these long-term gas infrastructure plans. There's a lot of room to negotiate and maximize the benefits to society, to our environment, to ratepayers. maintaining improvements to these long-term gas infrastructure plans. That's the other takeaway. So I'm going to let Madeline now talk about the NPAs.
Great, thanks, Kurt. So just quickly, right before we open it up for question and answers, is just briefly talking about a workshop that we are expected to see launch within the later half of this year for the People's Gas Service Territory. And that is a non-pipeline alternative workshop. So Kurt briefly mentioned this in the California bill. So this would be not legislation, but a workshop process. And so just to start, an NPA or non-pipeline alternative are strategies and technologies that can defer, reduce, or avoid a needed upgrade in gas infrastructure or new gas infrastructure. And so these alternatives aim to achieve the same goal or need met by the customer through the gas infrastructure, but being met potentially through electrification, energy efficiency, or thermal energy networks. So an easy example of this is if a gas utility needs to repair an old leaky main that's being extended out to a couple of homes, maybe in a more rural area. And instead of replacing that main, which would then be added to the pie of revenue that we would all be paying for, would it be more cost effective and cheaper for the consumers if that gas utility instead just invested in electrifying those homes and retiring that pipe? So strategically pruning the system when it's cost effective. So not only is that great for our climate because we're switching people off or not expanding the gas system, but it's more cost effective than continuing to pay for those investments over the useful life of that pipe, which could last 60 to 70 years. So this workshop process is exploring ways potentially that the People's Gas system can maybe implement some of these technologies. We know from some of our partners that a request for proposal on just the workshop and who would lead that workshop will be launching sometime soon. So this is just another planning space to really question how we're investing in the gas system in light of our climate goals. Examples of where this has happened successfully is in Massachusetts. They have retired gas infrastructure, electrified customers. California's had large scale projects. And so this is a new area that's happening across the country, and Illinois is entering that conversation. So just another docket or workshop, I should say, to flag about how we are shifting the conversation or gas reliance potentially in the state of Illinois through planning, correctly making our investments in the system, and just getting more transparency into the process to see if these gas utilities are even considering alternatives to continuing to expand their system. With that, we thank you, and we can go ahead and open it up for questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Great. I learned a lot there. So thank you. A couple of questions. I'm seeing a lot of questions just about the ICC in general, and I'm not sure you guys are ICC experts. So I'll take that in mind when we're answering this. But, there were a couple of questions about whether ICC has jurisdiction over delivery charges and taxes. And like, how do they determine that when often those delivery and fixed charges far exceed the cost of gas? So I don't know if there's some comments you want to make on ICC's role with delivery charges or how they're put together in Illinois, or if you even know anything there. So just wanted to put that one forward. You're on mute.
I am on
Kurt,
mute. Sorry about that. So there are the ICC does have jurisdiction over those. The limits on those are some of those upstream charges, like transportation, actual procurement of the gas. Those things are subject to what's called a different version of the filed rate doctrine, meaning if they are rates that are set either by FERC, like the interstate transportation pipelines, those have to be passed through. The ICC doesn't have authority to say, hey, that interstate rate is unjust and unreasonable. FERC gets to decide that. So those have to be passed through. similar with like taxes and other things that the utility doesn't really have control over. To a large extent, those have to be passed through the customers. But like the distribution charge, that's like the distribution charge. That's how much it costs to provide the distribution system. That's exactly what the ICC um, is there for. And the fixed charge itself, that's how much is fixed, how much is volumetric. That's decided by the commission. The volume balancing charge, that's the actual cost of gas. So like the local distribution companies, so like People's Gas, Nicor, and Ameren Gas, they really don't make money on gas unless they have an affiliate. If they have an affiliate marketing company, then the affiliate might make money on selling gas. But the actual cost of the gas itself is generally a pass through to customers, where the LDC, local distribution company, is not actually making money. So and for the actual cost of gas, that's an unregulated market, and mostly the ICC does not have authority over that. That's generally been decided by Congress to be a competitive market. Yeah.
Great. Well, we have a couple other questions. This one, really important right now. What are the opportunities for community input and mobilization in this process?
That's a great question. For Future of Gas, at least, in the first phase, we did have public comment workshops where they would go to communities virtually in person, and folks could speak up on what they wanted to see with their gas provider. Right now, for phase 2, those are not scheduled. And so we've been advocating for public meetings and to have communities' voices heard. But you can always go to open meetings of the ICC and have those comments. Or email the facilitator directly. But yes, in phase 1, there were public comment opportunities. In phase 2, there's not been a public forum.
Thanks. This is an interesting one. Multiple natural gas utilities have sought ICC approval to rate base costs related to adding renewable natural gas to their systems. What is the presenter's view on RNG's role in the future of gas?
I'm happy to start. I can pass it to Curt. So RNG, NRDC argues that it's still methane gas. It needs to be accurately captured and accounted for. And it's also going to be hard to get enough RNG to be effective on the system because we are competing against California and Colorado, who have more established RNG markets. And so that's our feeling of that it's still gas. It's going to be hard to compete for, and it's super expensive. And so we know electrification and energy efficiency is more cost effective. I'd like to pass it to Curt too.
Yeah, so RNG is still methane. That's exactly what Madeline said. And the challenge with methane is it's 80 times more potent as a greenhouse gas over the first 20 years compared to carbon dioxide. So when you have naturally occurring sources of methane, think about like landfills and some agriculture. You do want to address that what we call biomethane. So that's like the biomethane that occurs naturally when things decompose and form methane. It's purified to some extent and turned into what the utilities call renewable natural gas. The challenge there is it's not entirely clear that mixing RNG into the distribution system is the best way to address that. There might be some other opportunities to mitigate that methane. It's kind of something that a lot of groups are looking into, is like what opportunities are you missing when you mix RNG into the pipeline system? Because remember, the pipeline system does experience leaks, and those leaks, if it leaks methane, that methane then 80 times more potent. So if we're trying to avoid leaks, maybe the distribution system is not the best way to mitigate biomethane. So that's our take.
Great. Sure. And we only have a minute. We'll send some resources on renewable natural gas, and it's generally natural gas that's coming from landfills or anaerobic digestion or things where not fracking, basically, or natural gas drilling. So That's typically what renewable natural gas is. I don't know if you guys want to give a little. That's basically what it is. Okay, I think we're at the end. I know there's another question about storage charge, but I think we're gonna end here because we're at 12:59. But I just really wanted to thank Curt and Madeline for this really great piece on the future of gas. I think this was a really great workshop. I'm glad to have it recorded. Again, we will send around information. Mark, I'm gonna, since you have your hand raised, I'll hit allow to talk. Mark, did you have a question? Nope, okay. Great, well, we'll send this around. Make sure you fill out the CLE document if you're an Illinois attorney to get the credit, and I'm gonna fill that out today. But just like a really big thank you to Curt and Madeline for having covered this conversation. I think it was really useful, so thanks.
Thank
All
you.
right, bye, everybody.